Tell him you liked when your thighs used to touch in the taxi. Tell her you wished you could have cried with her under the stars, but the circumstances were never right. Tell him he used to make things make sense in your dreams almost every night. Tell her she's just as whimsical as all of the beautiful things she adores. Tell him you still imagine yourself holding a sword every time you're scared thanks to that conversation you had with him 4 years ago. Tell her she's the reason you still have hope on otherwise hopeless days. Tell him you would have liked to walk along the train tracks with him and got to know each other if you were not so shy. Tell her you wrote an English essay about her being a lost soul and got an A- on it because it was too long. Tell him even though you don't know him, it breaks your heart to read about how sad he is. Tell her she looks pretty wearing baggy t-shirts, even though that doesn't sound like a compliment. Tell him he is a good listener. Tell her you're sorry. Tell him you remember everything he says to you because maybe you love him. Tell her that it was never her fault. Tell him you still think about him every time you pass that repair shop. Tell her you admire her ability to show her sadness creatively. Tell him you felt some type of a connection when he sang that song, even though you had never heard his talking voice. Tell her you wrote down a sentence she told you out loud about a pie chart and the beach and a boy she used to love, because the way she worded it was so sad and beautiful you wanted to remember it. Tell him you miss him and regret not spending more time with him. Tell her you wish she didn't kill herself because she and you could have been friends. Tell him you fell off a skateboard in a parking lot and lost your breath and cried, and later that night you sat on the balcony of that hotel and cried again while wishing he did not die. Tell her she's a good kid. Tell him you're glad he's not scared anymore. Tell her it's not so bad. Tell him you dreamt you and him were the only people who survived. Tell her you'll always remember that night she held onto your orange sweatshirt and acted like you were her mother. Tell him you still have his letter. Tell her that she should be famous. Tell him you wrote his name in the sand as a joke and an old lady read it out loud. Tell her she deserves to be happy, so it's a good thing she usually is. Tell him you don't really hate him. Tell her she reminds you of yourself. Tell him you thought his drawings were interesting. Tell her that it will be okay and somebody will hold her hand soon enough.